Good evening. My name is Ken Miller. I'm the director of Bayliss Public Library, which is now a member of the Superior District Library, which is an attempt on our part to expand the governance of the library and expand the financial support of the library system. And there are flyers out at our desk, our front desk, which will more fully describe what's going on with Superior District Library, so please pick one up on your way out. Richard Ford was born in Jackson, Mississippi and currently lives in Maine. He earned his BA from Michigan State University and taught in Flint before enlisting in the Marines. He's published 7 novels, including The Sports Writer, Independence Day, and The Lay of the Land, and 4 collections of stories. Independence Day was awarded the Pulitzer Prize and the PEN/Faulkner Award for Fiction in 1995, the first time the same book had won both prizes. Richard's currently a professor of writing at the Columbia University School of the Arts, and tonight he will speak about his new novel, Canada, that is a 2013 Michigan notable book. We're very pleased that he chose Bayliss Library as one of only 2 stops on his tour this year. The Michigan Notable Books program is designed to promote reading and raise awareness of Michigan's literary heritage. The program annually selects 20 of the most outstanding books published that year, titles that are reflective of Michigan's diverse ethnic, historical, literary, and cultural experience. The 2013 Michigan Notable Books program and tour are made possible thanks to the generous support of the Library of Michigan, the Library of Michigan Foundation, Michigan Department of Education, the Michigan Humanities Council, Myers, Michigan Center for the Book. For more information, you can check the Library of Michigan's website. After the program, we'd ask you to complete the questionnaire that you found on your chairs tonight and put them in the basket at the back of the room. Extra questionnaires are available if you didn't receive one. Copies of Canada will be available for sale and signing and for purchase. Richard, we're just delighted that you're here tonight. Someone commented just before the program, this is like the Rolling Stones coming. Everyone, please help me welcome.
Ken, I always told Christina that, Christina's with me, my wife is with me, that if she ever wanted to leave me for anybody, she could leave me for Mick Jagger. But then I saw Mick Jagger not long ago, and I think I'm actually in no jeopardy. Thank you all so much for coming on a Tuesday night when you could have been doing things out of doors. Now that the rain has subsided, it's a great treat for us, Christina and me, to be here. I want to thank the library and for everybody involved in the library for letting us come. We came from Booth Bay, Maine, and we were thrilled to get to be here. I want to thank Randy too, because the Notable Books program, whereby guys such as I am get to go to libraries, is such a great idea for us particularly. The book promotions, and I've been promoting Canada for 13 months. But I don't consider this to be a book promotion. But the greatest part about book promotions is that you get to meet readers. The thing that someone such as I am has in common with somebody else is that we're all readers. The reason that I'm a writer is that I was a reader in Jackson, Mississippi at the Carnegie Library, which is now the Eudora Welty Library in Jackson, Mississippi. So it's a kind of a natural fit for me. Christina said as we were coming over today, she said, it's such a sweet idea to have the library and writers sort of doing things together. And as I said, I said this last night, but I think it's still true today, that I can tell from my sales figures that a lot of you have been checking my books out of the library. One is impressed by this library, that it's such a center for things in town. We live in a little town in Maine, which is a little town, in Maine. I don't know, 500 or 600 people. And our library doesn't function the way this library does, as a cultural center, as a place where kids can come and seek shelter from their parents. My mother used to dump me. My mother was essentially a single parent. Although my father was alive, he just traveled on during the week. He was rarely there when I was growing up in Mississippi, and she would dump me in the library. And so that's what I always think about libraries, which it's a place where you can be away from actual parental authority, where your imagination can allow you to think things and look things up that maybe wouldn't be quite as appropriate at home. I got my first bad review at the library in Jackson when I was about 11 years old. Somebody wrote on the bathroom wall, "Richard Ford has the nastiest mind in Jackson, Mississippi." I don't know how they knew that. At age 11, I guess it must have been apparent. But I will say that it makes me particularly thrilled to win this award in Michigan, being a Mississippian and living in Maine, because Christina's and my bona fides, our Michigan bona fides, are pretty well intact. We met at Michigan State in 1964, and we had our first romantic trips together to Charlevoix, and I know Charlevoix probably seems like Atlanta to you. But we came to Northern Michigan and to the UP together when we were just teenagers. So we feel part of life here, and we come here as often as we can. What I propose to do is read to you something out of this book from the beginning, and then maybe if you want to, we can talk about it, and you can, if you have a question about it, and then I'll maybe read something else if I get boring. So with your permission, I'll just read you the beginning of this book. And the beginning of a book has to make sense. It's always troublesome to read the middle of a book, because then you have to spend 5 or 10 minutes explaining who everybody is and what happened before and what everything's leading to. Whereas if I can read the beginning, then if it's any good at all, then I don't have to explain anything. First, I'll tell about the robbery our parents committed, then about the murders, which happened later. The robbery is the more important part, since it served to set my and my sister's lives on the courses they eventually followed. Nothing would make complete sense without that being told first. Our parents were the least likely two people in the world to rob a bank. They weren't strange people, not obviously criminals. No one would have thought they were destined to end up the way they did. They were just regular, although, of course, that kind of thinking became null and void the moment they did rob a bank. My father, Beth Parsons, was a country boy born in Marengo County, Alabama in 1923 and came out of high school in 1939, burning to be in the Army Air Corps, the branch that became the Air Force. He went in at Demopolis, trained at Randolph near San Antonio, longed to be a fighter pilot but lacked the aptitude, and so learned bombardiering instead. He flew the B-25s, the light medium Mitchells that were seeing duty in the Philippines and later over Osaka, where they rained destruction on the earth, both on the enemy and undeserving people alike. He was a tall, winning, smiling, handsome 6-footer. He barely fitted into his bombardier's compartment with a big, square, expectant face and knobby cheekbones and sensuous lips and long, attractive feminine eyelashes. He had white, shiny teeth and short black hair he was proud of, as he was of his name, Bev, Captain Bev Parsons. He never conceded that Beverly was a woman's name in most people's minds. It grew from Anglo-Saxon roots, he said. It's a common name in England. Vivian, Gwen, Shirley are men's names there. No one confuses them with women. He was a non-stop talker, was open-minded for a Southerner, had graceful, obliging manners that should have taken him far in the Air Force, but didn't. His quick hazel eyes would search around any room he was in, finding someone to pay attention to him, my sister and me ordinarily. He told corny jokes in a Southern theatrical style, could do card tricks and magic tricks, could detach his thumb and replace it. make a handkerchief disappear and come back. He could play boogie-woogie piano and sometimes would talk Dixie to us, and sometimes, like Amos and Andy, he lost some of his hearing by flying the Mitchells and was sensitive about it, but he looked sharp in his honest GI haircut and blue captain's tunic and generally conveyed a warmth that was genuine and made my twin sister and me love him. It was also probably the reason my mother had been attracted to him, though they couldn't have been more unsuited and different, and unluckily gotten pregnant from their one hasty encounter after meeting at a party honoring returned airmen near where he was retraining to learn supply officer duties at Fort Lewis in March 1945, when no one needed him to drop bombs anymore. They were married immediately when they found out. Her parents, who lived in Tacoma and were Jewish immigrants from Poland, didn't approve. They were educated mathematics teachers and semi-professional musicians and popular concertizers in Poznan who'd escaped after 1918 and come to Washington State through Canada and became, of all things, school custodians. Being Jews meant little to them by then, or to our mother, just an old, exacting, constricted conception of life they were happy to put behind them in a land where there apparently were no Jews. But for their only daughter to marry a smiling, talkative only son of Scotch, Irish, Alabama backwoods timber estimators was never in their thinking, and they soon put it out of their thinking altogether. And while from a distance it may seem that our parents were merely not made for one another, it was more true that when our mother married our father, it betokened a loss, and her life changed forever, and not in a good way, as she surely must have believed. My mother, Neva Camper, short for Geneva, was a tiny, intense, bespectacled woman with unruly brown hair, downy vestiges of which ran down her jawline. She had thick eyebrows and a shiny, thin-skinned forehead under which her veins were visible, and a pale indoor complexion that made her appear fragile, which she wasn't. My father jokingly said people where he was from in Alabama called her head Jew hair or immigrant hair, but he liked it and loved her. She never seemed to pay these words much attention. She had small, delicate hands whose nails she kept manicured and shined and was vain about and gestured with absently. She owned a skeptical frame of mind, was an intent listener when we talked to her, and had a wit that could turn biting. She wore frameless glasses, read French poetry, often used terms like cauchemar or trou de coule, which my sister and I didn't understand. She wrote poems in brown ink bought through the mail and kept a journal we weren't permitted to read, and normally had a slightly nose-elevated, astigmatized expression of perplexity, which became true of her, and may always have been true. Before she married my father and quickly had my sister and me, she'd graduated at 18 from Whitman College in Walla Walla, had worked in a bookstore, featured herself possibly as a bohemian and a poet, and had hoped someday to land a job as a studious small college instructor, married to someone different from who she did marry, conceivably a college professor, which would have given her the life she believed she was intended for. She was only 34 in 1960, the year these events occurred, but she already had serious lines beside her nose, which was small and pinkish at its tip, and her large, penetrating gray-green eyes had dusky lids that made her seem foreign and slightly sad and dissatisfied, which she was. She possessed a pretty thin neck and a sudden, unexpected smile that showed off her small teeth and girlish, heart-shaped mouth, though it was a smile she rarely practiced, except on my sister and me. We realized she was an unusual-looking person, dressed as she typically was in olive-colored slacks and baggy-sleeved cotton blouses and hemp and cotton shoes she must have sent away to the West Coast for, since you couldn't buy such things in Great Falls. And she only seemed more unusual standing reluctantly beside our tall, handsome, outgoing father, though it was rarely the case that we went out as a family or ate in restaurants, so that we hardly noticed how they appeared in the world among strangers. To us, life in our house seemed normal.
My sister and I could easily see why my mother would have been attracted to Bev Parsons, big, plank-shouldered, talkative, funny, forever wanting to please anybody who came in range. But it was never completely obvious why he would take an interest in her, tiny, barely 5 feet, inward and shy, alienated, artistic, pretty only when she smiled, and witty only when she felt completely comfortable. He must have somehow just appreciated all that, sensed she had a subtler mind than his, but that he could please her, which made him happy. It was to his good credit that he looked beyond their physical differences to the heart of things human, which I admired, even if it wasn't in our mother to notice. Still, the odd union of their mismatched physical attributes always plays in my mind as part of the reason they ended up badly. They were no doubt simply wrong for each other and should never have married or done any of it, should have gone their separate ways after their first passionate encounter, no matter its outcome. The longer they stayed on, and the better they knew each other, the better she at least could see their mistake, and the more misguided their lives became. Like a long proof in mathematics in which the first calculation is wrong, following which all other calculations move you further away from how things were when they made sense. A sociologist of those times, the beginning of the 60s, might say our parents were in the vanguard of an historical moment, were among the first who transgressed society's boundaries, embraced rebellion, believed in credos requiring ratification through self-destruction, but they weren't. They weren't reckless people in the vanguard of anything. They were, as I said, regular people, tricked by circumstance and bad instincts, along with bad luck, to venture outside of boundaries they knew to be right, and then found themselves unable to go back. Though I'll say this about my father. When he returned from the theater of war and from being the agent of whistling death out of the skies, it was 1945, the year my sister and I were born in Michigan at the Wurtsmith base in Oscoda. He may have been in the grip of some great unspecified gravity, as many GIs were. He spent the rest of his life wrestling with that gravity, puzzling to stay positive and afloat, making bad decisions that truly seemed good for a moment, but ultimately misunderstanding the world he'd returned home to, and having that misunderstanding become his life again. It must have been that way for millions of boys, although he would never have known it about himself or admitted it. Our family came to a stop in Great Falls, Montana in 1956, the way many military families came to where they came to following the war. We'd lived on air bases in Mississippi and California and Texas. Our mother had her degree and did substitute teaching in all those places. Our father hadn't been deployed to Korea, but been assigned to desk jobs at home in the supply and requisition forces. He'd been allowed to stay in because he'd won combat ribbons, but hadn't advanced beyond captain. At a certain point, which happened when we were in Great Falls and he was 37, he decided the Air Force was no longer offering him much of a future, and having put in 20 years, he thought to take his pension and muster out. He felt our mother's lack of social interests and her unwillingness to invite anyone from the base to our house for dinner may have held him back, and possibly he was right. In truth, I think that if there had been someone she admired, she might have liked it. But she never thought there would be. It's just cows and wheat out here, she said. There's no real organized society. In any case, I think our father was tired of the Air Force and liked Great Falls as a place where he thought he could get ahead even without a social life. He said he hoped to join the Masons. It was by then the spring of 1960. My sister Berner and I were 15. We were enrolled in the Lewis for Meriwether Lewis Junior High, which was near enough to the Missouri River that from the tall school windows I could see the shining river surface and the ducks and birds congregated there, and could glimpse the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul depot where passenger trains no longer stopped, and up to the municipal airport on Gore Hill, where there were 2 flights a day, and down the river to the smelter stack and the oil refinery above the falls the city took its name from. I could even on clear days see the hazy, snowy peaks of the Eastern Front, 60 miles away, running south toward Idaho and north up to Canada. My sister and I had no idea about the West except what we saw on TV, or even, for that matter, about America itself, which we took for granted as the best place to be. Our real life was the family, and we were part of its loose baggage. And because of our mother's growing alienation, her reclusiveness, her feeling of superiority, and her desire that Berner and I not assimilate into the market town mentality which she believed stifled life in Great Falls, we didn't have a life like most children, which might have involved friends to visit or a paper route, scouts, and dances. If we fit in, our mother felt, it would only increase the chance we'd end up right where we were. It was also true that if your father was at the base, no matter where you lived, you always had few friends and rarely met your neighbors. We did everything at the base, visited the doctor, the dentist, got haircuts, shopped for groceries, just must be like a place. People knew that. They knew you wouldn't be where you were for long, so why bother taking the trouble to know you? The base carried a stigma, as if things that went on there were what proper people didn't need to know about or be associated with. Plus, my mother being Jewish and having an immigrant look and being in some ways bohemian, it was something we all talked about, as if protecting America from its enemies wasn't decent. Still, at least at the beginning, I liked Great Falls. It was called the Electric City because the falls produced power. It seemed rough-edged and upright and remote, yet still was a part of the limitless country we'd already lived in. I didn't much like it that the streets only had numbers for names, which was confusing, and my mother said meant it was a town laid out by pinch penny bankers. And of course the winters were frozen and tireless, and the wind hurtled down out of the north like a freight train, and the loss of light would have made anybody demoralized, even the most optimistic of souls. In truth, though, Berner and I never thought of ourselves as being from anywhere in particular. Each time our family moved to a new place, any of the far-flung locales, and settled ourselves into a rented house, and my father put on his pressed blue uniform and drove off to work at some air base, and my mother commenced a new teaching position, Berner and I would try to think that this was where we'd say we were from if anybody asked. We practiced saying the words to each other on our way to whatever our new school was each time. Hello, we're from Biloxi, Mississippi. Hello, I'm from Oscoda, it's way up in Michigan. Hello, I live in Victorville. I tried to learn the basic things the other boys knew and to talk the way they talked, pick up the slang expressions, walk around as though I felt confident being there and couldn't be surprised. Berner did the same. Then we'd move away to some other place, and Berner and I would try to get situated all over again. This kind of growing up, I know, can leave you either cast out and adrift, or else it can encourage you to be malleable and dedicated to adjusting the thing my mother disapproved of, since she didn't do it and held out for herself some notion of a different future, more like the one she'd imagined before she met our father. We, my sister and I, were small players in a drama she saw to be relentlessly unfolding. As a result, what I began to care about greatly was school, which was the continual thread of life besides my parents and my sister. I never wanted school to be over. I'd spend as much time inside school as I could, poring over books we were given, being around the teachers, breathing in the school odors, which were the same everywhere and like no other. Knowing things became important to me, no matter what they were. Our mother knew things and appreciated them. I wanted to be like her in that way, since I could keep the things I knew, and they would characterize me as being well-rounded and promising, characteristics that were important to me. No matter if I didn't belong in any of those places, I did belong in their schools. I was good at English and history and science and math, subjects my mother was also good at. Each time we picked up and moved, the only fact of life that made moving frightening was that for some reason I wouldn't be allowed to return to school, or I would miss crucial knowledge that could assure my future and was obtainable nowhere else, or that we go to some new place where there would be no school for me at all. Guam was much discussed. I feared I'd end up knowing nothing, have nothing to rely on that could distinguish me. I'm sure it was all an inheritance from my mother's feelings of an unrewarded life, though it may have also been that our parents, a swirl in the thickening confusion of their own young lives, not being made for each other, probably not physically desiring each other as they briefly had, becoming gradually only satellites of each other and coming eventually to resent one another without completely realizing it. Our parents didn't offer my sister and me enough to hold on to, which is what parents are supposed to do. However, blaming your parents for your life's difficulties finally leads nowhere. Well, that's the beginning of this book. It's a, don't know if you can tell from what I read, it's a book about twins, boy, girl, who live in Great Falls, Montana, and their father gets out of the Air Force and immediately falls into financial straits and gets involved with some bad Indians. And they set up this scheme to steal beef and sell it to the railroad. And that crazy scheme comes apart almost immediately. And then the Indians terrify him by threatening to kill all of them. And this takes place in 1960. And he gets so scared that he decides that he has to rob a bank, and he does rob a bank with his wife. Kids are at home, and he and his wife are almost immediately caught and put into prison. And the girl runs away to California, and Dell, who tells this story, is shipped off to live with strangers in Saskatchewan, which is directly north of Montana there. And the book is told in the present tense. The fictive present of the book is now, or at least 2 years ago, 3 maybe. And it's basically Dale, when he's 66 years old, retiring from his teaching job in Windsor, Ontario, having become Canadian long before, never having been an American again. And the story is told just at that point when he has to find his sister again. So that's the premise. That's the premise of the book. It's a complicated premise of the book, but it's basically a book about. It's a shoot 'em up, really. You know. Banks get robbed, people get murdered and buried in the prairie. And, some Indians are good, and some are bad. Some white people are good, some are bad. If anybody has a question about that little rendition, I'll be happy to try to answer one. Yes, sir.
Is there anything in there about your own life? Did you write about something you know about?
Well, the old Hemingway saw is that you're supposed to, the writers such as I, imaginative writers, should write about things we know about. If I had done that, I would have had to quit writing about 35 years ago. I quickly run out of what I knew. The better way to put that is to write about what you're curious about. Write about what you have a moral interest in. And that moral interest and your curiosity will allow you to encircle things that you didn't know and take in things and find an affiliation with things that you didn't know before, and that'll keep your brain going. Specifically, no. I mean, my parents didn't rob a bank, and I didn't have a sister. I'm not yet a Canadian, though it could be that we will all eventually. Probably the only thing that was specific to my life was that I, because of what things that happened in my life, recognized that the period of Dell's life, 15, 16, in which these events occur, I knew from my own life was a very significant moment of transition out of adolescence and into young adulthood. My father died when I was 16, and that was a real transitional point in me because I was an only child, and my mother was completely wrecked by my father's death. They had been married a long time before I was born, and I just basically had to grow up in about 5 days, and that's what happens. This will sound cruel. It's not such a bad thing. It's a very bad thing for my father to have to die at age 55, and a very bad thing for my mother to be without him for the next 20 years of her life, practically. It was a bad thing for me not to have a father and to be an only child, but I always think that if my father had lived, he would have put his thumb on my life, because I was a bad kid. I was in trouble with the police. I was getting lots of trouble, and he didn't have a chance to put his thumb on my life in the way that he would have. And so I got to straighten myself out and become sort of the author of my own deeds. Because after my father died, my mother, I was already in juvenile detention. My mother said to me, she said, if your father's dead, I have to get a job. If you get in trouble again, I'm not going to get you out of it. Mm-hmm. I just heard that. And plus, I heard it in a good way too. It wasn't so much worrying about getting stuck in jail. I really wasn't. Excuse me, I wasn't worried about that. I was worried about the trouble I would cause her. I thought, don't cause your mother trouble. And so that allowed me to find some compassion in myself that I perhaps didn't know I had at that particular time. So that was the only recognizable to me autobiographical part of the book. Just the period of life in which it takes up. Yes, sir.
It seems like by Dell getting sent north at the time he does, and I haven't read this yet, but I can't wait. He's going to avoid Vietnam kind of unknowingly or unwittingly.
That's right. That's right. He does.
Boy, everybody in this room wishes they were in that situation
Yeah,
at
me
one
too.
point. You know?
I wish we'd all avoided Vietnam.
Yeah.
Right. That by becoming a Canadian and by going off to college in Canada, Vietnam was not an issue for him. There's a little bit at the end of the book about very little tiny bit about Vietnam. His sister, because she runs away rather than letting herself be transported with him to Saskatchewan, his sister, Berner, runs off to California and sort of becomes a sort of a marginalized creature for the rest of her life, and doesn't live a particularly good life. So in terms of the sort of the historical moment in which the book takes place, her life partook more of the American experience than his life partook of the American experience, because he went to Canada and lived in Manitoba and went to college in Manitoba and was a school teacher in Windsor. So he missed all of that, indeed. Yeah. But it's worthwhile, though. You know, I don't know if you know the Auden poem called La Musée des Beaux-Arts. And the La Musée des Beaux-Arts is an Auden poem in which he describes Icarus falling out of the sky, having flown too close to the sun, that his wax wings melted and down he went. And it's from a Bruegel's painting, actually. While Icarus is falling, there are some farmers over here who are just being farmers. They're just cutting wheat, and they don't know from nothing about Icarus. And it's a wonderful painting, and it's a wonderful poem, and it's worthwhile to know that when so much was going on in America in Vietnam, and our kids were dying over there uselessly, boys and girls, and their kids were dying uselessly, boys and girls, then a lot of people were just going along their merry way, more or less. They weren't taken up in Vietnam at all, like Dale Parsons was not taken up in Vietnam at all. It's a worthwhile thing to think that. I mean, not that it in any way, by thinking such a thing, subordinates its importance. It's just worthwhile to know that over here something else is happening. gives you some sense of the complexity of the world when you think that everything that bothers you bothers everyone. It doesn't. Anything else I can answer? Yes, ma'am.
Take us through the writing process, say for this book.
This book had a very unusual writing process. I started this book in 1989, living with Christina in a little Wheat Prairie town called Dunton, Montana. And I was waiting for the galleys to come back from another book I had written, and they were slow coming back, and so I thought, well, write something. It's what you are, you're a writer. So I wrote 20 pages of a story that I called Canada, and the sort of little nugget, the donné of that book was about a boy being transported against his will across the border from the United States to Canada. I never got even to the point of figuring out why he would be transported against his will, or what circumstances would have caused that, because then my pages came back and I put the 20 pages that I had written into the freezer of our refrigerator and just actually didn't think about them very much again for the next 20 years. Except I would make notes. I would think, every time I think about a note that would fit with my little Canada story, which I sort of vaguely remembered, I'd write it down on a piece of paper and stick it in this envelope, which was in the freezer. But I always thought to myself as those years were going by, someday I'll get around to this. Because it seemed to have some pungency for me. It seemed good, what I remembered of it. I didn't ever look at it again. Wrote 5 or 6 other books. And so I changed publishers about 5 years ago. And when I changed publishers, it was because I wanted to write this Canada book. And my publisher, Alfred Knopf, didn't want to pay me enough for it. So I thought, well, I'm going to take my show on the road. So I went to HarperCollins. And then I thought, well, I'm going to do this now because they're paying me some money. So then I got out all of those notes. And there I had, 300 notes. And I had my 20 pages, and I thought, well, I won't look at those 20 pages because those 20 pages were written way back in 1989, and they may be bad. They may be discouraging, or they may be wedded to some way I was feeling, 20 years younger, and I don't want to be held back by that, so I didn't look at them. I just got my notes together, and I sort of, what I do is when I write a novel, I get a big plastic bound ring binder notebook, and I make little divisions in it. And one division would be for the narrator of the book, and another division would be for his sister, and another would be for his mother, another would be for his father, another would be for Great Falls, another would be for Saskatchewan, and on and on and on. I have about 20 divisions, and I take all my notes and I just type them all out into various parts of this notebook, so that I get this big fat notebook full of my collated previous notes, and then I study that, just as if you were going to study for a bar exam, for instance. And then in the process of studying those notes, I just find where the story wants to begin, and then I find where it wants to end, and I see what arc it has, and then I start copying things out of that notebook on 3x5 cards that I want to write on a given day. So that's how it works. Clerically, it's a hellish morass. But it allows me, because my memory is probably no better than most people's memory, and the only way I can make my memory work is to write everything down. And so when I write it down, it means to me that it's been important to me. Then I go back and I see if it is important sometime later. I try to get all that stuff stuck into the book somehow or another. So, Ruskin said that composition is the arrangement of unequal things. And composition for me is very much the arrangement of things in an almost mosaical way, of things that have not heretofore gone together, but that have become together when I put them in a book. Yes, sir.
So you really have created an elaborate outline.
You could call it an outline, but it's
At least it's a structure.
Yeah, I know I know from my preparation where something's going to start, about what the points along the course of the book it will traverse, and then I know what's going to.
Timeline, a storyline.
Yeah.
Character line.
But not very specific, and certainly nothing that was so dictatorial that I wouldn't change it if I dreamed up something better along along the process.
I have one question.
Please.
What does it mean to get a Pulitzer Prize?
It means you have a really good day. A really good day. And
I read some book earlier this year. It's not over.
It's all over the show.
It's all over with the shouting. This was the guy was a reporter,
yeah,
and he said that was his goal in life. If he could get that, in other to prove himself, it meant a great deal. to
yes.
him.
He was that's a book about a journalist.
Yes.
Yeah, and that means it means a different kind of thing to a journalist from what it means to a fiction writer like me or to a poet. I think it's much more of a validation to a journalist than it is to a novelist. All prizes that novelists win, they probably shouldn't win, and they probably only win because maybe Philip Roth had a bad year. There isn't that kind of high five sense of elation. What I thought was, well, I wrote a book, and it's credible, and people can think, yes, this is a book, I don't mean to say it wasn't confirming or validating. It was, but so much fortuity goes into it. You have to be lucky. Inevitably, there are 3 books that get nominated, and then the judging panel chooses among the 3, and maybe your book's is the least long of the 3. It's not. It's great for a day, and it's great for Christina because Christina was at the time the head of city planning in New Orleans. And I was in France, in Brittany, in France, the day that this was announced. And when she got back to her desk, there was a whole pile of post-it, little "while you were out" calls, and people had written her notes saying that Richard won the Pulitzer. And it was nice. It was nice for her. It was nice for me. And then you have to go back to work. And I don't mean in any way to poo-poo it. But the truth is, what I have discovered now, I'm 69, is that the joy, the satisfaction, the challenge, the wonderfulness of being a writer is absolutely in the doing. It's absolutely in the doing. That you get to do it. That you have allowed yourself, given yourself permission to do this thing that Chekhov did, and that Hemingway did, and that Faulkner did. That to me means the most, because every year since I won the Pulitzer Prize, that they announce it, I want to win it again. But I don't. So I have to think, if I'm not going to win it again, and if somebody else is, I have to take my satisfactions elsewhere. I never thought I was a person who won prizes. Never did. And winning a couple like that, it hasn't changed my sense of myself. Yes, sir.
Did you ever go back and reread the original 20 pages?
I started to read them at a point near the end of the book, because near the end of writing Canada, I thought, well, maybe you better go back in there and read these pages, because there might just be 1 or 2 little gems in there you want to haul out. But I got about a page in, and I'd written them in terrible pencil handwriting. I write with a pen anyway. And I just thought, this is too painful. It wasn't that it was bad, it was just different.
You're 20 years older.
I was 20 years older, and I'd written a bunch of other things. I might have thought that I was a little better than those pages looked at that particular time. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Your prose sounds almost poetic when you're reading it, and I wonder if that's conscious. And when you're revising or when you're writing your novels, do you read them aloud for that purpose?
I certainly do, and I read the whole book aloud to Christina at the end, every last living word. It takes 5 weeks, all day, every day. She has a manuscript, and I have a manuscript, and we sit in a room, and I read the book to her, and she stops me, and I explode and lose my temper, and with little by little we fight our way through, right? Because I just want to be accountable for every word. I just want to be sure, because what authorship means to me is that I authorize every word, every stop, every period, every choice, whatever choices are involved, that I've authorized every one of them. And the only way I can really do that is by reading it aloud. And so I care about, choices of words. I care about syncopations and rhythms and sentences. Those are things all my teachers when I was young were poets. Darla Hall, Galway Cornell, at Michigan. Yeah, I care about it a lot. Probably why I'm not rich. Well, I'll read you the end of this book. Well, not the very end. That would be a travesty to do that, because the end is the best part of this book. And it takes place actually in Windsor. And actually kind of takes place in a trip that Dale makes across the bridge, up to Port Huron, across the Sarnia, back to Windsor. So that's why I say this book is sort of saturated with Michiganiana. So I'll read you just a little bit at the end, which has to do with him retiring from school teaching and visiting the place where the murders in this book took place, which is in Saskatchewan. I have always counseled my students to think on the long life of Thomas Hardy, born 1840, died 1928, to think on all he saw, the changes his life comprehended over such a period. I try to encourage in them the development of a life concept, to enlist their imaginations, to think of their existence on the planet not just as a catalog of random events endlessly unspooling, but as a life, both abstract and finite. This is a way of taking account. I teach them the books that, to me, seem secretly about my young life: The Heart of Darkness, The Great Gatsby, The Sheltering Sky, the Nick Adams stories, The Mayor of Casterbridge, A Mission into the Void, Abandonment, A Figure, possibly mysterious, but finally not. These books are taught now to high school students in Canada. Who knows why? My conceit is always crossing a border, adaptation, development from a way of life and living that doesn't work toward one that does. It can also be about crossing a line and never being able to come back. Along the way, I tell them, if not the facts, at least some of the lessons of my long life, that to encounter me now at age 66 is to be unable to imagine me at 15, which will be true of them, and not to hunt too hard for hidden or opposite meanings, even in the books they read, but to look as much as possible straight at the things they can see in broad daylight. In the process of articulating to yourself the things you see, you'll always pretty well make sense and learn to accept the world. It may not seem precisely natural to them to do this. One of them will often say, "I don't see what this has to do with us." And I say back, does everything have to be about you? Can you not project yourself outside yourself? Can you not take on another's life for your own benefit? It's then that I'm tempted to tell them about my young life in its entirety, to tell them that teaching is a gesture of serial non-abandonment of them, the vocation of a boy who loved school. I always feel I have a lot to teach them and not much time, a bad sign. Retirement comes for me at a good moment. It's well and long accepted that I'm American, though I've been naturalized and have held a passport for 35 years. I, decades ago, married a Canadian girl fresh from college in Manitoba. I own my own house on Monmouth Street in Windsor, Ontario. I've taught English at the Walkerville Collegiate Institute since 1981. My colleagues are polite about my forsaken Americanness. Occasionally someone asks if I don't long to go back. I say not at all. It's right there across the river. I can see it. They seem both supportive of my choices. Canadians think of themselves as natural acceptors, tolerators, and understanders, but also impatient, nearly to the point of resentment that I even had to make a choice. My students who are 17 and 18 are generally amused by me. They tell me I talk like a Yank, even though I don't, and tell them there's no difference. I tell them it's not hard to be a Canadian. Kenyans and Indians and Germans do it with ease. And I had so little training to be American anyway. They want to know if I was a draft dodger long ago. Why they even know about that, I can't fathom, since history is not what they study. I tell them I was a Canadian conscript, and Canada saved me from a fate worse than death, which they understand to mean America. Sometimes they jokingly ask me if I changed my name. I assure them I did not. Impersonation and deception, I tell them, are the great themes of American literature, but in Canada, not so much. After a while, I don't chime in anymore. Canada did not save me. I tell them it did only because they want it to be true. If my parents hadn't done what they did, if they'd survived as parents, my sister and I would have both gone along to fine American lives and been happy. They simply didn't, so we didn't. Thank you. It's nice to get to be at the library, particularly. I feel like I belong in every library. I feel like I belong in this one, so thanks for coming tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.